welcome back, everybody. Those were such fantastic speakers, and we'll look forward to being able to distribute the recordings as well. We are very excited. We have a lot of great resources today, but we're very excited to launch the consortium's case studies library, which is another field-facing resource that is years in the making. And an important investment of the consortium. The Case Studies Library has two main objectives. One is to help societies and institutions to prevent and effectively respond to harmful conduct affecting marginalized and vulnerable populations. And the second is to equip students and early career professionals and women, members of the LGBTQ+ community, and people with intersecting racial identities that are targeted for bias at all stages of career to navigate harmful situations in a way that affords some self-protection without excusing organizations and everyone in a community from responsibility for prevention and effective response. Case studies 1, 3, and 4 are now available on the consortium's webpage as publicly facing resources to encourage both societies and institutions to engage their overlapping communities and build more inclusive and equitable STEM fields. You can see the descriptions on this slide, and case study 2 will be available by the end of September. The case studies involve toxic situations, abuse of power, disrespectful and harassing behavior during society meetings and activities, in work outside of classrooms, when socializing and work are mixed, and in other isolated and high-risk contexts. While some facts may seem unbelievable, they are based on anonymized examples from the field. Some of the case studies involve violations of law or policy, but all of them recognize the limits of law and elevate understanding of conduct that undermines ethical, inclusive, and equitable STEM communities with or without a technical violation. The case studies are designed for flexibility. They can be used by individuals for self-guided learning or in facilitated group discussions for a range of audiences. Each case study has two main parts. Section 1 lays out the facts and the scope of issues and is segmented into several bite-sized chunks. Each chunk is punctuated by pause and process questions for reflection about issues raised. Section 1 is for self-learners as well as group discussion participants. Section 2 is segmented into the same bite-sized chunks as Section 1, but adds recommended responses to Section 1's pause and process questions, as well as guidance on preventative and response actions. Section 2 is for facilitators who are preparing to lead a group discussion. It is for participants to reinforce learning after a group discussion, and for self-learners to review after they have reflected on issues that they've surfaced on their own. In using the case studies, focus on its chunked design, not on its full length. You do not need to, and you probably will not want to, use an entire case study in any single session. The introduction applies across the board. It sets the stage and helps the participants to empathize with the main characters involved. The case studies note which chunks fit together well and can be used on their own with the introduction. And that enables a society to easily create a 1 hour, a 2 hour, a 3 hour session, whichever you would like, focusing on one or a few bite-sized pause and process chunks. Or you can combine those shorter sessions into a discussion series held over a period of time. Societies also may want to consider the audiences they'd like to engage in a case study. You don't have to involve everyone out of the gate. This can be a progressive endeavor. For example, you can start with a small and receptive group, such as an ethics or diversity committee, or a committed senior leadership team. Consider complementing these friendly groups with a student or early career group that wants the guidance. And then when you're ready, expand to other more challenging audiences, which will require probably a very well-trained facilitator. I want to thank Lisa Battalia, one of the principal authors of the case studies, along with our former colleague and Title IX coordinator, Rachel Pereira. And I'll now hand the baton over to Lisa. I'll just say that the same things that I said about societies could apply for institutions of higher education as well. Lisa? You are muted.
Thanks. I know Taylor put the link to the case studies library in the chat box. It's right under library. It's a brand new section called case studies library. Easy, super easy to find. In addition to the case studies themselves, and there's the two sections that Jamie mentioned, we've created some supplementary materials. These are used to complement the case studies, and they can be used across their sections 3, 4, 5, 6, and they can be used across all of the individual case studies. Section 3 is a guide for facilitators with some facilitation techniques, some of which we will preview today. Section 4 is a checklist for effective society and institution policies and practices. Section 5 is a list of questions to guide individual action, and section 6 is a national support resources list to help those who may be triggered by a case study. We want to mention that the case studies were developed with the sustained and hard work of an advisory council working group on this slide here of both our members of the advisory council leaders in higher education and members of our society and leaders in society. We are enormously grateful for all the work they put into these case studies, and as well as the leadership council, who as always provides great guidance to us to make sure that our tools are as effective and useful as possible to our society members. The rest of today, we will be preparing to use the case studies, and we're going to do so by using one part of one case study to practice facilitating a difficult learning discussion. Rest assured, we're going to first receive some coaching from an expert panel that I'm going to introduce in a minute. And then after that panel, we're going to break into small and safe breakout groups to practice facilitating. The aim of these workshops is to build the muscle needed to engage with groups that, for purposes of this exercise, we're going to assume are committed and open to learning. We will introduce 1 to 3 difficult situations that could arise when you use a case study as a training tool for equity and inclusion back in your society. The first situation imagines a participant of goodwill who doesn't appreciate why certain conduct is harmful, but is basically open-minded. The second is a participant who's triggered by the conversation. And the third is a participant who's intentionally disruptive. As Jamie just mentioned, we recognize that more training or perhaps even an outside expert is going to likely be needed to facilitate audiences that include some of these more difficult disruptive participants, or where a person might be triggered. But you can start small, start with your friendly audience, and with that you can build a group of well-informed leaders and allies for equity and inclusion. Our breakouts today are intended to prepare you to do that, to work with a friendly audience and be prepared and comfortable doing that. Later, you can expand your use of the case studies to more challenging audiences, and we will explore ways in our next year's work plan that we can either ourselves provide some additional training or perhaps access to experts at a favorable group rate to our consortium members. So we're going to ask you as you go into those breakouts to spend most, if not all, your time on the breakouts on the first situation. Someone who's open to learning, reluctant but open to learning, and through that, build that muscle to navigate difficult conversations that you can take away with you today. If there's time, and if depending on the time, depending on what your group decides, you might address the other more challenging situations. We'll leave that to each group. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our panel, who's going to be offering some coaching on facilitating these kinds of difficult conversations that are likely to arise when you take these case studies back and use them with your society. We're joined by Lisa Maxwell, who's an expert mediator and the director of the Training Institute at the National Conflict Resolution Center in San Diego. Their contact information will be clearly provided in the report and the compendium, so you can reach out to them as experts here. Lisa is going to be joined by 2 of our own society leaders who have had experience with difficult conversation in their roles in the society. Billy Williams, who you all know is the Executive Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the American Geophysical Union and co-chair of our executive committee. And Stacie East, who I think many of you have gotten to know, she's been very involved with us this year, a lawyer and the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Entomological Society of America. Sorry, Stacie. ESA is on the executive committee, and Stacie is a member of our leadership council. We thank Billy, Stacie, and Lisa for sharing, Lisa Maxwell, for sharing their practical wisdom and expertise. And as a Lisa, I'm turning this over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa Battalia. And it's such an honor to be here. I want to make sure everyone can hear me okay. I'm in San Diego, California, and I have been the director here. I've worked here for quite a few years, over 30 years I've worked here, and been doing a lot of work around mediation, conflict resolution, communication, inclusiveness. And I entered this idea of upstanding about a decade ago, working with the Navy, helping sailors to be able to come from a place of support with their shipmates when there was sexual harassment happening. So that's how I entered this area. And I have to say, I am so impressed with the level of detail and the way you're looking at these case studies. So very impressive. And so thank you for that. I am supposed to talk a little bit, and then I'm very excited to talk with Stacie and Billy. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, Stacie and Billy, now, or do you want to say a couple words before I go on, or do you want to wait till the conversation?
Can wait.
Okay. Well, I'm very excited to have a conversation. I was extremely impressed with both Billy and Stacie. So I'll talk for a few minutes. I don't want to spend too long because I think that conversation is really important. When I look at the case studies, when I look at what you're doing, what it tells me is you want to be prepared, you want to feel comfort. And so these case studies will help everyone in this space to be able to really take a look at how do I gain confidence and comfort with being an upstander, helping my department, my university, my research group, whatever it is, help them to be much more aware of the impact of microaggressions and other negative. And I would agree with what I heard Jamie say earlier, the things that you're going to read are hard to believe, and yet we know they're true. And so being able to do that is going to be very important. So one thing I just want to talk about, my approach is I don't like to do gotcha kind of impact, looking for things that are wrong and looking for me to be the savior of the situations. I think my perspective is kind of seeing our shared humanity, trying to see that, of course, people are going to say and do things that reflect the bias and the systemic racism that we've all been swimming in. And so the reality is, I have this idea that I'm going to come from a place of compassion. I'm going to come from a place of empathy, and yet I want to move that dial. I want to help create more inclusive in places. And so how I'm going to do that is going to make a difference. So some of the things that they asked me to talk about is we have some tips that we utilize, and a lot of entities find these tips really helpful to look at how they approach conversations. So here are some of the tips, and then I'm going to just talk about a few of them before we bring the conversation in with Billy and Stacie. Work on trying to be thoughtful instead of trying to prove that you're right, and that's a difficult balance, because what will happen is you have a lot of knowledge, many of you have lived experience, and the idea of trying to be thoughtful when you know you're right is very difficult. But the point of that is the attitude you bring into that conversation. And if you turn it into a competition, many people who are engaged in microaggressions are going to push back, and they're going to feel threatened by that. So if you're trying to be thoughtful and have that attitude of thoughtfulness and let's think about what just happened, it's going to be more helpful. Whether it's these case studies or real life, I think it's helpful. So that's kind of a growth mindset, I would say. Acknowledge that you have the right to your feelings, and it's okay for you to be upset. By doing so, you will be able to move through your own emotions better. Then you'll be able to accept the other person's reactions as well. So that acceptance of your own reaction, especially with lived experience that's been very painful, it's natural that you're going to have some emotion when you hear and see things to some of your colleagues. So I think the other aspect of that is watching your timing, a little bit on your timing. If you feel too much energy, emotional energy, perhaps stepping back or asking someone else to talk about it may be helpful, because it's only natural that some things are going to be triggers for you. The other part is they are naturally going to be defensive. That's called being a human. When we get feedback that goes against how we see ourselves, we're going to be defensive. So I try to absorb some of that energy, acknowledge their natural defensiveness, and not take it personally. That's part of a reaction. So I kind of think about it like a wave. I kind of point something out gently. They may react defensively. I acknowledge them, and then I go back to my point. So it's kind of going back and forth with that energy to make sure I'm not going to be, set aside, but also being gentle with how they might take that feedback. So 3 is letting go of believing you own the only truth about the situation. And I think that's true in every interaction, that I don't have your life experience. I don't know what you've been through. I know for a lot of faculty, academics, the work they have gone to get to where they are, there is a sense of, but I had to go through that. I went through that. So I don't have that experience that they might have had. So being willing to hear their truth and then making sure my truth is there as well is helpful. So if we want to move the slide, thanks. Recognize that ignoring or attacking the other person rarely gets you what you want. I was doing some work with Stanford University, and a ethnically Hawaiian manager came to me and said, my manager that I see as a friend has, for the past 5 years since I started working with him, had a lot of ethnic slurs against my race, disrespectful comments, but I don't know what to do. So he ignored it for 5 years, and now he wanted to do something about it. And so how he did that was really, we'll get to in a little bit, but ignoring it doesn't make it go away. And so being able to not just put up with it anymore is not a choice for many of us. That time has passed. Now we want to make things happen, but attacking is not going to really get us what we want either. So do what you can to really listen to the other person as much as possible. Show genuine curiosity about what led them to their opinion or the way how they see the world. And for me, I have had many conversations with people that have done these kind of microaggressions and worse, and helping them see it, me being willing to listen to them has been incredibly important, because it helps us shape that conversation together. So we are able to kind of co-create by each of us telling our perspective in a way that's respectful, what might look like in the future for more respectful relations. Ask yourself, how can I say what I want to tell them in a way they can hear it? I think that's important when you're giving someone feedback, because if you say it in an aggressive way, or if you don't make it important for them. For example, I had a leader who was saying things and doing things that were pretty disrespectful. And one thing I asked him was, I know that your sense of being a leader is really important to you, and your reputation as a leader is important. Let's just think about how the reputation will be impacted by these jokes that you're doing, or whatever the case was. So that really was something important to him. So really thinking about what's important to that person, and how can I frame my question so that it will be something that they value in a sense. Oh my, there's a lot on this one. Sorry. Know this, almost all conflicts have their basis in underlying needs not being met, such as respect, acknowledgement, acceptance, and fairness. The more you can communicate your needs instead of your complaints, the better off you'll be. And that is key to everything I do. As someone that engages in difficult conversations a lot with a lot of people and help people work through their difficult conversations, that really trying to understand the needs of both people without judgment. So that is a key piece of communicating through difficult conversations. And I try to say what my need is. Like, I'll say one thing that's really important to me is on this team that we treat each other with respect and dignity. And this is something that's a value that I have. Let's talk about what your need is in the situation. So it can really help to make it less aggressive, but clear what's important to each person. And most people don't push back when you talk about needs. They actually can have that conversation even if they've said some things that are inappropriate or taken actions. Take time. Sometimes it's hard to work when you're angry. I kind of addressed that one. Don't be afraid to acknowledge responsibility for any mistakes you might have had or acknowledge what the person is right about. These gestures go a long way to build momentum. And the Hawaiian manager that I talked to, I asked him about this. I said, what if you acknowledged that you had put up with it and laughed at his jokes for the last 5 years? And so you recognize that he was just doing what he thought was okay and comfortable for you. What if you did that? Would that help? And he was so relieved because he did not want to be confrontational. And that's why he had put up with it so long. And so that ability to acknowledge, hey, I know we joked about this, but I really thought about it. And I found that it's made me uncomfortable. So for him, that piece was really important to have that conversation with. So the last one is, this is a value I have. I'm not sure everyone does, but I think when we're doing these case studies, when we're having these interactions in real life as well, no matter what you are doing to de-escalate the situation, and no matter what the other person may be doing that might escalate it, come from a place of respect, understanding, and humility. And for me, in a difficult conversation, I am not going to change to aggressive approach, no matter what they're doing, because I don't want to have someone else control who I am and how I show up. And so instead, I'm gonna continue to have power with them. And I think that we have to recognize that power plays a big part in this. I'm not going to let them overpower me, but I'm also not going to overpower them. And I have this stance, and that's the energy I'm pushing out. And for some people who are very aggressive, they're uncomfortable, but I find that we are having power together. And I'm not going to do either of those, either take your power away or be intimidated by your power. And so that attitude, I think, helps to have a difficult conversation. And I'm going to stand in that space and be comfortable in that space and walk away knowing I did what I could to work through this conversation effectively. So those are some tips, and I could obviously talk about all of this for many hours. It's my favorite subject, but I am so excited to work with Stacie and Billy to have that conversation, and I want to leave plenty of room for that. So
thank you very much, Lisa. Appreciate it. And just for our people listening, those tips are in a folder that you're going to have access to during the breakout. So you can continue to take a look at them. I think they're fantastic tips. I feel like I've learned a lot every time I read them. And I'm going to turn this over to Stacie, who will begin a conversation with Billy and you, Lisa, to kind of flesh out some of these themes a little bit more. Thank you all. And don't feel rushed, by the way. You have, I think, if we have about 20 minutes really to talk, and then we'll transition to talking about what the fishbowl technique will look like before we break out.
Thank you, the two Lisas. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about difficult conversations. Having meta conversations about conversations is one of my favorite activities. So, Billy, we're here to have, and Lisa, we're here to have a conversation about having tough conversations in the workplace around issues of bias and fairness, inclusion and exclusion, safety, and the lack of thereof. I'd like to structure our conversation a little bit. First, I'd like to talk about our backgrounds as they relate to having tough conversations, then our frameworks for having tough conversations, and then instructions for the breakouts. So first, Billy, I think our personal and professional experiences impact how we approach and feel about difficult conversations. What should we know about you that will help us understand your framework for difficult conversations?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Stacie. And I enjoyed listening to what Lisa had to say about approaches and her values as she dealt with difficult conversations. But for me, my framework is for approaching difficult conversations was forged primarily through my personal values. forged through strong Southern Black family influence. And so the framework is also influenced by my identity and training as a scientist. And with formal training also that I've achieved in addressing difficult personnel issues when I was working with an organization, a for-profit organization, leading global research teams in industry for more than 20 years. So I've had formal training in leading people, and part of that formal training was also in dealing with difficult conversations. So again, so many people don't know that my formal education and first career was as a synthetic organic chemist. So as a scientist, I've always had a love for data to help with decision making, including data gathering before approaching difficult conversations. So the strong family influence and personal values instilled in me an unending drive for fairness and respect for all. And this was learned through me coming of age in the Jim Crow South and having to fight for justice and equal treatment at every step along the way during the early and mid stages of my career. And so this formal training and my experience has also given me the confidence to lean into difficult conversations and to be open to hearing other points of views rather than to shy away from them. So summing up, I approach difficult conversations knowing that the person on the other side is a human being who should be treated with dignity and respect, even when they may be on the wrong side of a harmful or unethical action. So what about you, Stacie? I bet you've had more than a few difficult conversations.
Yeah, I have had many. So I was a criminal defense attorney. I practiced criminal defense for over 25 years. So I've probably had thousands of difficult conversations from different positions, advocating for a client, telling a client bad news, telling a family member bad news. Obviously, being a Black woman in a courtroom is a whole nother level of advocacy. I think, because we can't ignore our backgrounds. I'm not religious, but I'm Buddhist leaning. And I think that part of that, which has been really helpful for me, is kind of taking all of my ideas and all of my preconceptions really lightly. And so at least I try to do that in conversations with other people, and knowing that when I have an idea in a conversation, that idea is always going to be informed maybe by data, but also by my own perceptions, my own biases, my own positionality. I too like to prepare for difficult conversations. What do you do to prepare for conversations that are hard, Billy?
Yeah, so the conversations, the majority of my difficult conversations in my current role are primarily around follow-up on issues of allegations of professional misconduct. So it's not around job performance or personnel issues where you're releasing somebody from a job, anything like that. So it's around dealing with issues of professional misconduct, and in many cases, those have to do with sexual harassment or some forms of discrimination. So, and many times I'm the lead person on delivering news to the respondent around AGU opening up investigations against individuals or around sanctions. So my preparation is typically doing the background work to ensure that I assemble all of the relevant facts. Then I have to clear my head of any judgment about the other person. But most times there is pushback, and the person on the other side will claim they are the victim, even when they're the person causing the harm. And I've learned, and Professor Jennifer Freed from the University of Oregon and founder of the Center for Institutional Courage coined a term for that. And she calls it DARVO, D-A-R-V-O. It stands for deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. So people will always say, no, I'm the victim here. So they reverse the order. And it's amazing how often that happens. I prepare to be ready for DARVO with every conversation. And that plays out nearly 100% of the time when dealing with issues around sexual or gender harassment.
So I have to ask, how do you respond to Darbo?
I first of all, I expect Darbo. So like Lisa suggested earlier, just come back to the points I was trying to make. I don't try to convince them one way or the other. I just say, I hear you. Here are the issues. Here's what we're going to do. And here's what you can expect going forward. So I ignore Darbo.
When you're having a tough conversation, how do you adjust for your positionality? So the fact that you're a Southern Black man who grew up in civil rights, who have a certain positionality. You're an executive vice president of a large organization. You have a certain level of experience, a certain personal presence. Like, how do you adjust for that when you are having a difficult conversation?
Yeah, and I want to hear you about this question as well, but this question really makes me think, Stacie. And but as I think about that, I do believe I do adjust for positionality. For example, as a person in position of influence, I strive not to be directive with others, but to rather achieve progress through asking questions. So this plays out not only when I'm having difficult conversations, but as I'm interacting with any individual. I try not to be directive because of my position of authority, especially within my own organization. And I was once told by friends of my now young adult daughter that I stand 6 feet 5 inches. So as a 6 foot 5 inch Black man, I can be physically intimidating. And so I've also formed my professional personality to take a non-threatening approach, even when I'm dealing with others on not only when I'm dealing on potentially difficult issues, but also non-difficult issues. And I also try to have a non-heavy-handed approach based on my position of organizational authority. Because sometimes when I'm talking to people and I express an opinion, they might take it as a directive. Billy said this, therefore AGU is ready to go do that. So I'm very careful about what I say or how I say it. And more often than not, if I want to achieve something, I will do it through asking questions. Have you considered this? Have you considered that? So that's been my personal approach, and it's worked for me.
Right. Well, good. Thank you. And I'm gonna ask Lisa a question, kind of along the same line. How should people in general think of their positionality when engaging in difficult conversations?
I think that's a great question, Stacie, because I think that there is a power piece in that, and who has the position, who has the power in a certain sense. I also think of being aware that one thing that we had talked about, Stacie, was that if the microaggression or inappropriate, disrespectful action is being done by someone that looks like us, in some way identifies in the same way as us, people are going to assume if we don't step up and say something that we are in agreement. Whether it's right or wrong, it doesn't matter. It's just the fact of the matter is that since we don't stand up, since we don't say something, that positionality we have that's similar to the other person, people will assume we agree. And I think that really speaks to the importance of how we're all in this together and we all have a role. And so making our voice be heard is going to be really important, especially if we're the look or the identity that people associate with some of these microaggressions in the team. So I don't know if that's what you wanted me to talk about.
Yeah, that's, I think, a great answer. And I guess personally, one of the questions that I'm always asking myself is, do I understand how I am relating to the group, right? So I think that most of us on this call, regardless of our race, we have been inculcated in Western culture, which is a certain level of individualism, a certain level of aggression. And sometimes that might not be appropriate for the situation based on who else is in the room or who else is engaged. And so I'm always trying to be aware of what I bring to the table. In some ways, just because of the water I swim in. I mean, it's the air I breathe, and not everybody else breathes that air. But we had a question for the audience, and I'm going to ask it to you, Billy, which is, would Darvo be considered gaslighting, or would gaslighting be a form of Darvo?
I think Darvo is a bit different from gaslighting. In my opinion, it's a bit different because it's really just reversing the script. In fact, this past week, I had a difficult conversation with someone where I was informing them that we were forcing that person to be recused from some activity because of what we had now in our hand to be some complaint. And he flipped the switch and said, no, that complaint is false. That person is behaving unethically by making this situation known. So he was flipping the script, saying he was the victim and the other person was at fault and should be investigated instead. And you could call it gaslighting. I call it, I don't know what to call it, but it's bold. But I've seen it so many times when you accuse somebody of something, they not only push back, but claim that they are the victim. And there's literature on Darvo. I think you can look it up and you'll see some written articles about it in the literature.
Well, I'm going to ask one last question and follow it with a question to you, Lisa. So, Billy, so honestly, for me, at this point in my life and career, I realize that difficult conversations are most challenging for me, or I guess I'm most disappointed in my performance when I'm facilitating a difficult conversation, when I go in thinking there's only one correct answer, and it is my responsibility to ensure that the conversation ends at my perception of the correct answer. So for you, at your point in your career and life, Billy, what makes difficult conversations most challenging for you personally?
I think it's when I see the other person's point of view. Maybe there's a sanction coming down as the other person might see as being a little bit too harsh or doesn't fit the crime or whatever it is. And I kind of empathize with that, but I can't say that. I say, this is the results. Here's the sanction. I can't say this is wrong. I will say, this is what's going to happen. And these were the results of the investigation or whatever it is. So I think it's difficult more when I actually see and understand the other person's point of view, but I'm still required to deliver the strong message, the right message, and make sure that the actions are implemented.
Right. And
you might see that as well as an attorney, I'm not sure.
Well, that happens all the time, right? And on that vein, I think as an attorney, the most difficult position is when you, on that line, is when you disagree and you know that it's in the person's best interest. That happens. Lisa, what as teaching facilitation, what is kind of one of the most common challenges of facilitators?
Well, if I may, Stacie, I just want to comment that what Billy said is really interesting to me because of his role. And in his role, having that empathy and seeing that they have a good point is difficult because he's supposed to give that bad news. Yeah. And so in that space, the empathy is challenging for that particular aspect of his work. And yet he has demonstrates so much empathy in so many other ways and other aspects of who he is and how he lives his life from what I've met him and what he's been saying. And so for me, I think the strength is empathy for peers, that if you can have empathy, that can really help. And I really appreciate what Stacie said as well, because her point that the hardest thing for Stacie is when she thinks there's one right answer. And as a mediator, I've trained myself over many years to know there's never one right answer. And so I think one of the difficult things in teaching people to facilitate, I guess it depends on what we mean by that, because sometimes it's just in the moment, you need to say something. And that, I think, being grounded and being practicing is going to make all the difference, because now it won't feel like it's uncomfortable because you've done it enough. So the more you practice, the better it is, and the better you can work on your tone, work on how you do it. I think what I would say, a deeper conversation where it's not in front of a bunch of other people. So a direct statement in the moment can be very helpful, but a deeper conversation when you have equal power to be able to dialogue in a deeper way. And I would say being genuine, thinking about what your values are, and being willing to listen are the things that are going to be the most important to bring to that conversation. And so I would encourage not only direct comments, but being willing to dialogue. And again, the more you practice it, the more it feels natural, and it feels like it doesn't have to be a scary thing. I don't know if that was what you're looking for, Stacie, but. Did Stacie freeze?
You may have frozen. And Lisa, I would just say this, what I've learned just based on your comments and my approach is, when there's a difficult conversation, you often hear the term lean into it. I do have to lean into it. I have to go into it, say, I'm going into this thing, rather than I'm timid or I'm afraid or whatever. It's like you lean into it, and the person on the other side is human just like you. And what's the worst thing that's going to happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think having that kind of confidence is really important.
Yeah.
Confidence and humility, both of those.
Yeah.
Stacie, you're back.
I lost internet for a moment.
I know. We thought we lost you there for a moment.
It won't happen again, but you never know.
You can't say never.
Yeah, say never.
Not with technology. Do we have any other questions from the audience, Taylor?
Yeah, so we have one. One is, what do you believe is an effective approach in dealing with misinformation, and especially disinformation when encountered? Both seem so prevalent today.
Oh, wow.
That's a real difficult question. And in some ways it depends on the context, right? I think it is very difficult to have a conversation with someone whose understanding of the facts is different. And so I guess my analysis would begin with, is that person committed to not understanding the facts? Is there the potential for common ground on the facts? Can the issue be resolved without complete agreement on the facts? But if the issue cannot be resolved without agreement on the facts, and the person is committed to disagreement with the facts, I honestly believe that conversation simply comes down to power and control, or having it or not having it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Stacie, I like that. The only other thing I would say is that if it's deliberate distortion of the facts for something that has an impact on someone else, and that becomes an ethics issue, which could result in some formal sanction or follow-up from our ethics office. So it depends on like you said, it depends on the context. If it's misinformation that's deliberate and deliberately harmful or hurtful to somebody or somebody's career, then that's a whole different situation than just somebody failing to acknowledge the truth.
Looks like Jamie is raising her hand.
I was just going to say how helpful all of this is, and just sort of in a sense circle around back to the context of facilitating a case study. So you are in a group of individuals, and one of the things that in our preparation for this panel, I think all of you helped me understand. So I just wanted sort of share it back is the notion of really trying to have empathy and understanding for where everybody's coming from. And it's sort of acknowledging where everyone's coming from, but then also help people. And one of the objectives of these case studies is to help people walk in other people's shoes. So how to sort of redirect a conversation to a place where I'm hearing you on this. Many of the things you were talking about, the things that I'm hearing you on this, but can you imagine what it might be like for somebody with these values and these identities and these positions, who and how they might feel, and try to sort of build some of that empathy so that it's not attacking someone, but it is asking them to try to think from another perspective. And I don't know, I just wanted to throw that out, because if there's something that any of this panel wants to sort of elaborate on that, to me, that was one of the most helpful comments about how you facilitate a case study where you're trying to actually help people learn to look at things from a broader perspective than their own.
If I could, Jamie, I would just say that when you're doing these case studies, when you're talking about them this afternoon, just be prepared. There's going to be some times where it feels a little uncomfortable, and that's okay. That's if you have a growth mindset, if you want to learn and talk with each other to get better at this, to really stand up for each other, it's going to happen. There may be some times where there's a little bit of discomfort, and just lean into that, because that's how we grow. Change occurs on the edge of the comfort zone. So be prepared for that, and just, buckle up, be ready, because you're going to learn from each other. You're going to learn from the mistakes that people make, and just allow that space, create that space where it's psychologically safe. And we're going to just make some mistakes and be better humans because of that. That's what I would say.
Thank you. I see that Vicki would like to have a question or make a comment. And I just want to make sure I'm on schedule for the instructions for the fishbowl.
So let's have Vicki ask a question or comment, and then we'll shift to the instructions.
Okay, perfect.
Super quickly. The only thing I was going to add is that in echoing Jamie's comment about the empathy and walking in somebody else's shoes, is also that the case studies don't have to be about changing attitudes in the short term, right? Because attitudes are not going to change that quickly, right? So getting somebody to walk in somebody else's shoes is that first step to trying to change broader attitudes. And, I mentioned in one of our breakout sessions yesterday, the psychological literature is pretty interesting in terms of learning. It actually takes 7 ± 2 times of exposure to material to actually learn it. Mm-hmm. So 5 to 9 times of exposure to material. So just keeping that in mind in trying to facilitate any kind of workshop like this, or anything with these case studies, is that, if you have somebody who is being disruptive or who is, kind of questioning or whatever, you may not change their attitude, but trying to open their world a little bit is a huge success, right? It's a huge success.
And
Thanks.
Important, necessary first step. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Lisa and Jamie and Vicki, for those comments.